I'm going to punt it over now to Brian and let him talk to you all about some detail within the employment regulatory world. So thank you.
The Federal Fair Labor Standards Act is a federal wage and hour law. It establishes standards in 4 areas: minimum wage, overtime, child labor, and record keeping. This law was passed in 1938. Stop and think about that. Your day-to-day wage and hour compliance is determined by Depression-era legislation. And we may argue that that shouldn't be the case, but trust me, it is. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the highlights of the FLSA. I guess we should call them FLSA greatest hits. But let me start with probably the most important thing, and that is who's exempt from minimum wage and overtime. Who do you not have to pay overtime to? And there are a lot of exemptions in the Fair Labor Standards Act, believe it or not. There's like 70 of them. Some of them are pretty weird. There is, for example, a complete minimum wage, overtime, and child labor exemption for home workers who make Christmas wreaths out of natural pine, holly, or other forest products. Why, you ask, would there be such an exemption? Because many years ago, the Democrats needed the vote of Republican Senator Margaret Chase Smith of Maine to pass some FLSA amendments. Evidently, there's lots and lots of home workers in Maine. She didn't want them bugged by child labor or minimum wage, and that exemption was the price of her vote. It is said you should not look too closely into how laws or sausages are made. But there is one exemption that is applicable to every business, and that's the one we're talking about here. The complete minimum wage and overtime exemption for executive, administrative, professional employees, and outside salespeople. Now, the most common misconception about this exemption is that putting them on salary makes them exempt. That ain't going to do it. You can put the janitor on salary, call him the president, but as long as he spends his time sweeping the floor, he is entitled to overtime compensation. There are elaborate regulations that determine who can be exempt. There's both a salary test and some duties tests. And just paying them on a salary test doesn't make them exempt. So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by the salary test, and then let's take a quick look at the duties test. If you want somebody to be exempt, you got to pay them a salary. That salary is ridiculously low, $455 a week. That increase, what took place in 2004, the Obama administration has announced that they're revisiting these regs again. I expect that figure to almost double. I would expect that the minimum salary for exemption, and this can be done, remember this is regulatory, can be done without Congress, probably will be in the $950 to $1,000 range pretty soon. Okay, 2 general rules on the payment of salary to your exempt employees. Number 1, they got to be paid, subject to some exceptions, they got to be paid their full salary in any week in which they do any work at all. General rule number 2, they don't have to be paid their salary at all in a work week in which they do no work. All right? Now, notice I use the phrase work week. The measuring stick for compliance with the wage and hour law is the work week. That ain't your normal schedule. A work week is a fixed and recurring period of 7 consecutive 24-hour days. Once you've established it, that's the period of time we use to measure compliance. So, apply those general rules to a work week basis. All right, exceptions. You can dock the salaries of exempt employees in these and some other situations. Hit the wrong button. Absence of employees for personal reasons or if they're sick, but only for full-day absences. And by the way, you have to have a sick leave plan, and they have to have used up their leave before you can dock them. Exempt employees, there's no requirement for vacation, but generally speaking, you got to have a sick leave plan for your exempt employees, and you can't dock them till they use it up, and then only in full-day increments. Now, you can dock leave balances in partial day increments. So, let me give you 2 examples. It's Friday morning. I'm a subordinate supervisor in your company. I wake up, I look out the window, the sun is shining. The birds are singing, the fish are biting down at the lake. I just don't come to work. You may dock my pay. That is a personal absence of a full day, and you may dock my pay. But if I wake up that morning, drag myself into the office, plop down at my computer, fire up my email, and suddenly realize work makes me tired. So I go home. Now you have to pay me. Can you charge my vacation for that partial day absence? Yes, you can. So let's say that I take off, let's say I make $500 a week, work 5 days a week typically, and I take off Friday afternoon. My paycheck has to be $500. You cannot dock me for a personal absence of less than a full day. But my check stub could read salary $450, vacation $50, gross $500. As long as it says gross $500, you've met your obligation under the wage and hour law. So, disciplinary suspensions, but only for full days. So if you have a sexual harassment policy in your company, as you should, and we'll probably talk about that next week, and somebody violates that policy, an exempt employee, and you decide to suspend them without pay, you can do it, as long as it's in good faith pursuant to a policy that's generally applicable. And violations of major safety rules. The government does not want to interfere in how you enforce your safety rules. So if you want to flog somebody or dock them or whatever, if they go light up a stogie out on the oil field or whatever, you can do that. Okay. That is sort of a very quick overview of the salary basis of payment. Now let's talk about the duties test. There are 4 categories of employees whom you can classify as salaried exempt, meaning you pay them their salary and you're done. The only limit to the number of hours an exempt employee can work is 168 a week. That's all there are. And I know we've all had weeks when it seems like we've worked that many. So, the first category of employee is the executive. What are the tests for an executive employee? The employee's primary duty, that means most important function, primary duty must be management. Management of the company as a whole or of a customarily recognized department or subdivision thereof. Primary duty test used to mean most time consuming, now it means most important. So your most important function used to be over 50%. I would be very unsurprised if the Obama administration's new regs don't go back to a 50% plus test. Okay, the 2 warm body test. To be exempt, as an executive, you got to supervise at least 2 full-time equivalent employees. Now think about that if you got a small store. Manager, assistant manager, 2 clerks. There ain't enough bodies there for both the manager and the assistant manager to supervise 2 each. You can't double up. The manager supervises the assistant and 1 other, and oops, you're short. You would have to have a minimum of 3 subordinates there. And trust me, if you got a manager, an assistant, and 3 clerks, no way the Department of Labor is going to let you have that assistant manager as exempt. Because there's no way you're going to have enough management that 2 people can claim to have management as their primary duty. You need to be safe. This isn't written down anywhere, but I spent 12 years with the Department of Labor enforcing this law. I was the enforcement supervisor here in Dallas until 1989 when I saw the light and went over to the side of the angels. Yeah, my old friends say it's the dark side. You know? And I can tell you that unless you get up to about 4 or 5 employees, they're going to look real closely. In other words, if you got a payroll supervisor with 2 payroll clerks, they're going to look real closely at that to be sure that that person is in fact have management as their primary duty and not just the most senior, experienced, hands-on person. HVAC tech, you know, the so-called maintenance supervisor, crew chiefs for landscapers. I must have represented 20 landscapers in the last year and a half, and in every one of them, the Department of Labor challenged the foreman. Because what's the foreman do? He's in charge of the crew, but he spends 90% of his time mowing the lawn, weed eating, you know, trimming. Very difficult to argue that his primary duty is management. Okay, and then hiring and firing. Now, in today's world, very few people have the power to hire and fire without limit. So the government, recognizing this, says to meet this test, they have to hire or fire, or at least have the power to recommend hiring, firing, promotion, discipline, etc., and those recommendations given particular weight. So that's the first category, executive. Second category is the hardest one to enforce, the administrative employee. Administrative employees are your non-supervisory, non-professional, high-level staff type people. The primary duty must be office or non-manual work, And it must be administrative in nature. That is, assisting in running or servicing the business. Now, that means not delivering to the external customer the product or service you're in business with. Administrative people deal with the internal customer. So people like HR, finance and accounting, IT, their customer is other employees, right? And that's the kind of people generally we're looking at. And they must make decisions in matters of significance using discretion and independent judgment. Everybody makes decisions. The secretary may decide to go to lunch at 11:30 versus 12. Bookkeeper may post payables before receivables. Not important. We're talking about higher level stuff. And they have to use discretion and judgment. And discretion and judgment means more than just skill and experience, more than just knowing the process. You got to make a judgment call. So, for example, your typical office manager does payables, receivables, payroll, bank reconciliations, not exempt. You got to be talking about people who make decisions. Personnel director, safety director, purchasing agents, people like that. Okay, professional employees. There are lots of types of professionals. There's learned professionals who basically require degree-level work in a recognized learned profession, like law, medicine, accounting, and engineering. Their work must be intellectual, and they must also use discretion and judgment. So, you can't just say because somebody's a CAD/CAM, uses CAD/CAM programming to do designing, that doesn't make them an engineer, doesn't make them an architect. It's got to be a learned profession. Okay, and then creative artists. That's Michelangelo there. That may be a rather broad representation of the Sistine Chapel, but and then teachers in educational institutions, and also outside salespeople. I was an English major. My favorite American play is Death of a Salesman, right? Willie Loman out there on a shoe shine and a smile. Well, that's who we're talking about here. People whose primary duty is making sales or obtaining contracts for services away from their employer's place of business, knocking on doors. Now, okay, that in a nutshell, a very brief nutshell, are the 4 categories of employees whom you can pay a salary. And if you do, they're exempt from overtime. Actually, outside salespeople don't require a salary. They're exempt just because. Okay. The rest of this conversation will address non-exempt employees, people who are required to record their time, people who are required to be paid minimum wage, people who are required to be paid overtime. Off-clock hours. This is one of the biggest class action or collective action cases that are filed these days. And these are where employers don't record and obviously therefore don't pay for all the hours that their employees work. What do we mean by hours worked? That's the phrase in the law. Hours worked means all time employees are required to be on the employer's premises, all time required to be at a work site, and, here's the catch-all, all time they spend in activities which are of benefit to the employer, whether onerous or burdensome or not. I can hire employees to do nothing at all. I know what you're thinking. We got a lot of those back at the shop. No, I could hire a security guard to sleep next to an alarm. I don't want him to have anything to do, but his mere presence confers a benefit on me, and he's working just like he was breaking rocks in the hot sun. So, you got to record that, you got to pay for it. Now, it is management's responsibility to see that time is accurately recorded and paid for. Employers cannot accept free work, even if it's voluntary. You hear this all the time. Well, I don't make them stay. They just want to stay late, or they want to work through lunch. Well, sometimes they don't want to. Sometimes they know you're going to yell at them if they don't. But even if it's totally voluntary, you got the benefit of the work. You got to record it and pay for it. And you know what? Sometimes, believe it or not, you got to jump on your best employees. You got to jump on the people that come in early, that work through lunch, that stay late. I know we all love those guys, but they are creating a wage and hour violation for you. And of course, they're all hardworking and honest. And if they get interviewed in an investigation, they'll admit what they're doing. So you need to make sure that your employees get paid. All right, here are the most common off-clock cases. Call centers. Not paying for preparatory or concluding activities. Call center, the calls start coming in at 8, but your guys have to sit at the computer at 7:45 to get set up. Their time starts at 7:45. And the first thing they do that is related to their employment, whether they turn on the computer and start looking at emails, whether they go through the inbox to see what orders there are, whatever it may be, that's when their time starts. Not when you call them productive or anything else. When they first do the first act that's part of their job. Not paying for travel time. I could spend an hour just talking about travel time, but basically, travel between job sites is hours worked. So let's say you got a construction company. Crew shows up at the shop at 7 o'clock. They get on a truck, they drive to the site and get there at 8. Do they have to be paid to drive from 7 to 8? If you require them to report to the shop, require? Yes. If you make it voluntary, maybe not. And if they do any work at all at the shop. So they show up at the shop, throw a couple of tools in the back of the truck and then ride. Their time started when they did that first activity that was related to their job. Throw the tools in the truck. So if you're going to do that, tell them that they have the option to report to the job site, and they do no work at the shop. All right. Employees working through lunch. To have a valid lunch break, you have to be both uninterrupted and relieved from duty. And those are not the same thing. If I tell my secretary to sit at her desk and answer the phone if it rings, she's working even if it doesn't ring, because she has not been relieved from duty. And not paying for training time. I love this one. Well, you know, they're not really productive for that first week, so we won't pay them. Yeah, you will. One way or the other, you'll pay them. A marketing subsidiary of a Fortune 50 company headquartered in this area some years ago had the idea that the first work week they wouldn't pay their employees. And I was still with Wage and Hour, so this was a long time ago. And we nailed them for hundreds of thousands of dollars, even though it was only a week. But they were so big, they kept cycling these people through and not paying them for that first week. You got to learn. Learning confers a benefit on the employer, and thus it is compensable working time. Okay, let's talk a little bit about overtime. Now again, this is another hour-and-a-half topic. But for most of us, the principal effect of the Fair Labor Standards Act is overtime. The requirement that we pay time and a half of the employee's regular rate for hours over 40 in a work week. Now, you might, to better understand overtime, you might need to understand the philosophy of overtime. Now, don't get me wrong, we're not going to talk about Aristotle and Plato. What I'm saying is, what is the intent of the law? Most people think it's to reward the employee. That's not what it's for. When was this law passed? 1938. What was going on? Great Depression, right? Unemployment's upward of 25%. So Congress made a policy decision. If you got 120 hours worth of work to do, they'd rather see 3 people do it in 40 hours than 2 do it in 60. So they made it more expensive for you to work the 2 people 60, hoping you'd go hire the third person. Overtime is not a reward to the employee, it's a penalty on you, the employer, for having the audacity to make people work over 40 hours. And because it's punitive, it's going to be enforced in a way that's very restrictive and punitive. It's supposed to discourage you, so you go hire somebody else. Okay, with that cheerful thought, let's talk about some of the basics here. I said the work week basis of enforcement is critical. The work week is this 7 consecutive 24-hour day period. Overtime is due after 40 hours worked in a single work week. So, what are the ramifications of the work week basis of enforcement? Number 1, you don't have to pay daily overtime. How many of you have branches in California? You're so lucky. For labor purposes, the United States of America consists of 49 states and California. All right. But California requires daily overtime. Alaska, Colorado, surprisingly, after 12. Not here in Texas and not under the federal law. Overtime after 40 in a week, no daily overtime. But you can't average work weeks together. If you pay every 2 weeks and a guy works 80 hours, but he worked 48 one week, 32 the next. That's 8 hours of overtime. And no comp time for overtime. Anybody here in the public sector states, political subdivisions of states? No. Public sector can pay comp time, private cannot. When I was an investigator, I used to go into apartment complexes and I'd ask the manager, "Do you guys pay comp time?" "Oh no, we pay overtime." Then I'd go down into the shop, talk to the maintenance guy, and I'd say, "Hey, let me see your comp time book." About half the time he'd pull out a book where they wrote down the comp time. Manager didn't even know. No comp time for overtime. Okay, overtime is due only after 40 hours actually worked. Paid time off does not count toward overtime. So, if a guy works, has a Monday holiday off with pay, and then works Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, he's going to get a check for 48 hours, but there's no overtime. Paid time off, whether it's holiday, vacation, sick, does not count toward overtime. Okay. Now, I told you that overtime was time and a half of the employee's regular rate of pay. That phrase, regular rate, was not just a casual term. It is a technical legal term, what we lawyers call a term of art. The regular rate is not what you agreed to pay them. It's not what they agreed to work for. It's not what's specified even in a union contract. And it can and often does change every week. Why? Because the regular rate, the rate upon which you must pay overtime, is defined as the employee's total compensation for employment attributable to a work week divided by total hours worked. In other words, you pay overtime on all compensation, not just base. So if you give your guys a base salary or base hourly rate plus some shift differentials or some commissions or some additional premiums for doing special jobs, all of that's included in the regular rate, meaning you pay overtime on all of it. So, bonuses, shift differentials, commission, piece rate, not just on the base rate. That means your regular rate can change every week. All right. Here are some of the regular rate exclusions. These are the things you don't have to pay overtime on. You don't have to pay overtime on Christmas bonuses. Isn't that nice? But let me make it as dramatic as I can. If you give your employee a $5,200 production bonus for what he or she accomplished in calendar 2013, you must allocate that bonus back at $100 a week to each of the 52 weeks in the year it was intended to recognize. Then you, in every one of those weeks in which overtime was worked, you must recompute the additional overtime due by virtue of having jacked up their average straight time rate. Think about it. If they work 50 hours in a week and I allocate $100 of that bonus to that week, I just added $2 an hour to their average rate of pay, which means I owe another $1 an hour for each overtime hour worked, because I have to add the overtime premium. So this is one of the most common violations of the law. Okay, you don't have to pay overtime on discretionary bonuses. This is a bonus where both the fact that it's to be given at all as well as the amount is only determined by the boss at the end of the year or the end of the bonus period. Expense reimbursement, 401k, payments to third parties, these are exclusions. If it's not on this list and a couple more things, you pay overtime on it. All right, let's talk a little bit about the minimum wage. This has been a hot topic. Of all things, after all these years, minimum wage is a hot topic. The current federal law, of course, is 7.25. Now, the president increased the minimum wage for federal contractors, which is within the right of the executive branch. But the general minimum wage cannot be increased without an act of Congress. It is highly unlikely that that's going to pass the House of Representatives. So they're trying to increase it to 10.10. I would say the odds are pretty strongly against it. Now, like overtime, it's enforced on a work week basis. So be careful with employees who are paid on a contingent basis, like piecework or commissions. They may make minimum wage and more over a month or a quarter or a year, but if they have one bad week, you still have to advance them enough to cover minimum wage for that 1 week, because each work week stands alone. Another way you can screw up minimum wage is with deductions. Now, I'm not talking here about legal deductions, which obviously you can gross minimum wage and net less. What I'm talking about here are deductions for the employer's benefit, cash shortages, damage to a customer's property. You want to get that kind of thing back from their pay. Did you know that you can, under FLSA, you can dock employees' pay for stuff like that without their consent? Now, I know you all tell me that's wrong. We know you can't do it. I hasten to add that the Texas payday law requires the employee's written consent for any deduction. But the FLSA doesn't require consent, but limits deductions for your benefit to the minimum wage. So, let's say I make $1 an hour more than minimum wage. 40-hour week, I make $40 over minimum. My cash register comes up $100 short. You want to get it back from me. If you take $100 this week, you just drop me $60 below minimum, violation. But if you took 40 this week, 40 next week, 20 the third week, you haven't dropped me below minimum wage, and you've recovered your money. With employee consent, of course, under the payday law. But by the way, the employee cannot consent to be paid less than minimum wage.